Good morning and welcome to Bible study. So glad that you are back with us again today. I was surprised actually when I pulled it out and I realized that we are back in 2 Kings here in PartyOn. I cannot remember a time when I have spent more time in the book of 2 Kings. It's not a place that we usually go, but interestingly, a lot of the stories are pretty incredible in the book of Kings. And it's amazing, even though this is a book, 1st and 2nd Kings in the Bible, that is about recording the events and the happenings and the ups and the downs of the kings and the kingdoms and the realm of Israel and Judah. It's incredible that so much has been written in these recordings, official recordings of what happened in the kingdoms about food and about meals. And so today we find ourselves back in 2 Kings chapter 25, and the verses are short. There are 4 verses here, verses 27 to 30. And so I feel like I have all the time in the world today, but I'll probably still end up being long. Actually, maybe not today. This one's pretty simple. The story behind today's 4 verses is not simple, though. It's quite complex. And so I might even encourage you that if you have some extra time on your hands, start earlier in chapter 25 and start reading down. And you're going to get a lot of the backstory as to where we end up in the 4 verses in which we've chosen for today. But before we get there, I just want to thank all of those who are part of Christ's Table, especially those who donate to make this ministry possible. You can find out more information about us, or you can be a part of financially supporting this ministry that brings so much incredible content and hope to you, and centrality on the table, both as a worship environment, but also the table as a relational tool for your family. And you can find out all of that by going to christtable.today. If you're watching this real time or close to real time, this weekend, we're having an event in South Florida. We'd love to have you be a part of one of our meals. In fact, it'll be taking place in this space right behind me here at the Young Cabin. We'd love to have you be a part of that. If you are in Northeastern Ohio, then we'll be seeing you in just over a week on Sunday the 27th. So looking forward to both of those. And sent an email last night out about those. So if you're on the email list, you got that. If not, I want to encourage you to sign up for the email list. We'll be sending out more information about those. But why don't we just go ahead and jump in here to 2 Kings. So we come to this text at a very kind of difficult time for the people of Israel. And if you've been along for these Bible studies at any point, whenever we're in the Old Testament, we've kind of pointed out this idea that for Israel, it has been quite a journey of good and bad in their history. And the times where they are prosperous, where they're receiving the blessing of God, where things are going well for them, when there's peace and prosperity, have come during those times when they are focusing on God, they're keeping His commandments, and they are worshiping Him. And those times where everything falls apart, where perhaps they're conquered, taken into captivity, where there's some lack of blessing that comes, discipline, as it were, those times come whenever they essentially have forgotten God. They start worshiping other things in their lives. They bring idols in. They believe that their peace and prosperity comes from their own hands and from their own minds rather than as a gift from God, and things begin to go south. And so we come here to this passage at a time when they have essentially turned their backs on God, and they are in the process of being conquered by Babylon, by a great person whom history remembers as Nebuchadnezzar II, in fact, here. And we're essentially at the end of the book of Kings. And that's pretty significant because we've seen all these ups and these downs. But as the book ends, it seems as though essentially there is no hope, that all hope is lost, that this time the destruction is so great. The temple and worship system has been destroyed. There's no way to offer sacrifices to God. no way to worship him officially by his guidelines. They have been removed from the nation in exile now. The great Babylonian, they're not going to conquer the great Babylonia of the ancient world. And so we're kind of left on a low note. And it seems as though all the hopes and the dreams and everything that's come before this time, the Genesis stories, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph with his 12 sons that become this great nation, these 12 tribes, Moses and the Exodus from Egypt, the promised land, all of the wilderness wanderings, Joshua, Samson, and Deborah, and all of these people who in the beginning began to lead the nation on behalf of God and help make decisions and help them become the people of God, eventually coming to Saul, who became king, and King David and King Solomon. All of these historical names and stories that have made them a great people, both in actuality and in spirituality, seem to be things that are going to be lost to time and history, that Israel will never come back, that none of the prophecies will ever come true. And then we come to this epilogue, almost an appendix, an addendum to the invasion and the exile. The Babylonian exile is what we call it. And there's still a glimmer of hope. And isn't that just like God? Isn't that just like God? In the toughest times, the most difficult of circumstances, the situations in which all hope is truly for good reason lost, and there is no human or earthly way that this is ever going to bring anything good or anything wonderful or any redemption from the terrible situation in which we find ourselves. And yet, there's that God factor. God finds a way, God makes a way, and there's always, even if it's just the slightest glimmer, there's always hope somewhere. And I think maybe if you would reflect back on the most difficult times in your journey or times in other people's lives around you, you would find that the same thing has been true as well. That you made it through, and that God always provided something, no matter how small, no matter how seemingly insignificant, something that brought hope or a reminder that things are not always as they seem. And so you made it through. That person made it through. Maybe not without bumps, maybe not without bruises, maybe not without a lot of suffering and heartache, and maybe a lot of that continues today. But there was still hope. With God, all hope is never lost. That's what we have when we get here to 2 Kings chapter 25, the final 4 verses to the story of the kings of Israel. So the king has been removed, assumedly died, and his son, Jehoiachin, takes over. Jehoiachin reigns essentially 3 months before he is captured. Israel and Judah are taken into captivity, and he remains there in captivity, in prison, for 37 years. 37 years. 37 years penalty, essentially for only having ruled 3 months before the invasion reached its final course and the king was taken into captivity. And so we come to verse 27, where we get the story after those 37 years are up. So Nebuchadnezzar II, the king who orchestrated and carried out all of this, has passed on, and a new king of Babylon, a new leader of Babylon, has taken the throne. And so in the 37th year of the exile of King Jehoiachin of Judah, evil Merodach ascended to the Babylonian throne. And so Jehoiachin, who's king of Judah for only 3 months, has spent 37 years in captivity. And the one who took him into captivity, Nebuchadnezzar II, has now passed on And a new leader, evil Merodach, has taken his place. You don't need to worry about the word evil. It's a name. What a name, right? But it's not a designation. In fact, he proves himself in this situation to be quite the opposite of evil, but to be, I would say, God's hand in a situation. And oftentimes, God uses people who are not his followers, and maybe this guy was, but unlikely. Oftentimes, God uses people who are not his followers to do his will, or he ends up working his will through the actions of others. But this guy seems to be the very opposite of evil. He ascends to the Babylonian throne, and he was kind. Entire sermons, entire series, entire Bible studies, I think, could be written about this idea of simply being kind. He ascends to the throne, and the first thing that's said about him is that he was kind to Jehoiachin. He released him from prison on April 2nd of that year. Remember, this is the recordings of the annals of the kings of Judah and the nation of Israel, and so lots of importance are given to dates and years. He spoke kindly to Jehoiachin and gave him a higher place than all of the other exiled kings in Babylon. And so he not only shows him kindness, but he shows him favor. He shows him that he is favored. Why? We're never told. Clearly, there were other nations, other tribes whose kings also had some sort of imprisonment, as well as it seems as though that evil Merodach also favors or gives them kindness to them as well, but doesn't favor them. And I think whenever we're going through difficult seasons, we have to be looking for kindness, and we need to be looking for favor. And I believe that it is always there if we will simply take off the lens that we're looking through and put on a different lens, even in times of suffering, even in times of trouble. And all the stories in the Bible really bear this idea out broadly as an axiom of life, in that for those who are following God, for those who are worshiping him, there's always going to be that ray of hope, that glimmer of hope. There's always going to be someone through those times, I think, who are showing kindness, if only we will recognize it. And I think, too, that we can also see in those moments God's favor. But oftentimes all that we're willing to see is the difficulty, the suffering, the trouble, the trauma. And we end up looking at those things rather than looking at the other things that are intended to give us hope and help us understand that we are not forgotten, that God has not gone silent, that he has not left us behind, but through the words, the actions, the kindness, and the favor of others, we still have reason for hope. So here we see that evil Merodach supplied Jehoiachin with new clothes to replace his prison garb. He allowed him to dine in the king's presence for the rest of his life. So he gives him favor, and he gives him a place at his table rather than eating whatever it was, gruel or whatever it was that they were serving under house arrest or in prison or wherever he is. Instead, he invites him into the king's table. Now he has favor. Now he has an audience every single day with the king of a foreign nation under which is holding him in captivity, and he's eating the king's food. So the king gives him a regular food allowance as long as he lives. And it just kind of ends right there. It's a rather odd way to end a historical record of the kings. It would be like going down to the county courthouse or pulling out like the Constitution, Bill of Rights. This is an official record. Going to the Library of Congress and reading, and it ends here. Now, that glimmer of hope isn't just for Jehoiachin, but I think it ends this way because this is also a glimmer of hope for the nation. The fact that Jehoiachin is alive means that the prophecies still have hope of coming true about there being a great kingdom and about there being a Messiah, because the Messiah, Jesus, had to be a descendant of the great king. So the fact that Jehoiachin and his line will continue means that there is still a chance that there will be a nation and that there will be a Messiah and that Jesus will come. And in fact, that comes true. Jehoiachin actually is in the line of Jesus, in that down the line, great grandson is Joseph. That Joseph who becomes betrothed to Mary and becomes the legal father of Jesus. And so this is hope. And it's interesting as well that that hope comes around a table. It's interesting as well how central Jesus makes the table as well. So a couple of things. No matter how bad things may seem, the table is a sure sign of hope. The table speaks more here than the words themselves. It's a sure sign of hope. Whenever someone is invited to the table, it's a sign of hope. Whenever someone is allowed to be at the table in this way, it's a sign of hope. So no matter how bad things may seem in your life, I think that over and again in the Bible, and this is just simply one of those passages that bear that out, no matter how bad things may seem in your life, I think that so often it is the table itself where we find hope, where we find help, where we find peace, and where we find God. Because we know and have learned that the table is central to God's plan, and the table is central to the kingdom of God and the Lord's Supper, right? Every time we're sitting at the table, we're supposed to remember what? We're supposed to remember Jesus. We're supposed to remember God, and we're supposed to remember the work that He has done to provide us hope. And so no matter how bad things may seem, I would encourage you to, in those moments, maybe as much or more than any other, to lift up the table and make the table central. And I think that that will be where you find those glimmers of hope. Second, and finally, a meal shared among enemies sends a powerful signal to all. Now, it doesn't seem as though evil Merodach and Jehoiachin here are truly enemies, but politically they're enemies in relation to their subjects. Israel would have seen, or Judah would have seen, evil Merodach as being an enemy, and certainly the Babylonians, I'm sure, would have seen in some way King Jehoiachin and the Israelites as being enemies as well. And so what a statement it makes whenever these two enemies are able to come together at the table over and over and over again. It sends a powerful signal that maybe whom we view as our enemy, or maybe whom we once thought or saw as our enemy, that may not be the case. It breaks down walls. It breaks down barriers between people. And perhaps even if enemies are at odds, it is oftentimes the table that is the only place where those things are broken down and enemies are able to become, if not friends, at least acquaintances. Jesus does this as well, right? Jesus sits down and has meals over and again with individuals who his network, his community, his religious constituency said those people are enemies. Tax collectors, people who committed treason, essentially financial treason. Jesus regularly shares a meal with prostitutes and other sinners, as the Bible says to them. Jesus, it seems as though, was almost out looking for people whom the world has said, that's an enemy, that's not somebody you should be associating with for one reason or another. And Jesus seems to intentionally seek them out and say, hey, let's go to McDonald's. He invites them to his own table. It sent a powerful signal. In fact, it sent such a powerful signal that it ends up being one of the primary reasons why they want him gone, why the crucifixion happens. I know that we attach all these theological constructs to the crucifixion and to Jesus' life, but at the end of the day, whenever you read the scripture, it is who Jesus shares meals with and who he treats as being equals with the religious elite. In fact, many times even he treats them better, gives them a favor in ways that he did not give the Pharisees and the Sadducees by sharing meals with them. It sends a powerful signal, one which they didn't like. And I would encourage you as well to recognize the power of who you share a meal with and use that for good. Use that for God. Well, that's all we got for today. And like I said, 4 verses, same amount of time. Doesn't matter, right? Until tomorrow.